Hi everybody, Eve Harow, Rejuvenation on the Land of Israel Network. It is just about closing January 4th, 2021, and beginning the 21st day of Tevet, 5781. Happy birthday to my son, Donnie. So this has always been a very auspicious day for me, and I hope it will be for everybody else. And I am really honored and delighted to have with me once again, Rabbi Natan Lopes-Cardoza, whom I've interviewed a couple of times. Some of you might remember. He's the head of the David Cardoza Academy. Also, in addition to his rabbinical ordination, has a doctorate in philosophy, and quite honestly, one of the most interesting thinkers that I have ever had the pleasure to read and to hear from and to follow. And I hope that those of you who are not familiar with his work might just agree with me in the next few minutes. So Rav Cardoza, thanks so much for joining me tonight on Rejuvenation.
Thank you very much for inviting me. Great honor.
So I guess you could be called the Rebel Rabbi to some degree, which also alliterates very nicely. You've authored so many books. And one of the things that stands out, well, there's a few things that stand out. One is your tremendous love for Judaism and for the Jewish people. And at the same level, I would say your, I don't know if dissatisfaction is the right word, but your feeling that we can do more in this time that we are, that to some degree Judaism has stagnated, that given the fact that we have miraculously come home to our own land, we now have challenges that aren't being properly met in terms of Judaism in a society, when it comes to Shabbat, when it comes to how religious laws merge with secular laws, if you will, or the laws of a society. And I've spoken to you about that before. I highly recommend that my listeners read your books because you go into it. It's so many things, from wearing a kippah to travel on Shabbat to what to do about wine. A lot of the issues that many of us just don't really think about, you think about. And I think that is tremendously needed. And many people I know feel this frustration also, that we love Judaism, but how do we get it to come into 5781 and be even more relevant than it is? So if you want to take a few minutes, please now to tell my listeners, tamtzit, if you will, the word in English just escaped me, like a distillation maybe of your thoughts. And then I would really like to talk to you this evening specifically about the crisis that we're all in now, meaning the corona crisis, but not the health aspects of it, but more the social aspects and even some of the religious and philosophical aspects. So maybe just give my listeners a little bit of an introduction to your thinking and your world, and then we can try and get into something more specific.
Okay, thank you very much. Perhaps the first thing to say is something about my background, because that has a lot to do with what I have to say about all these topics. All human beings are influenced by from where they come and how they have been educated, and so that is true about me as well. I come from a mixed marriage, Jewish father, non-Jewish mother, and also always thinking that I was Jewish, one day found out and discovered that I was halachically not Jewish, then made a long study about the Jewish tradition and made Giyur. I converted when I was 16 years old in Amsterdam, which is the place where I was born, in the Portuguese-Spanish community. Our parents or our great-great-great-grandparents came after the Inquisition from Spain and Portugal to Amsterdam, and there is where my family has been living for the last 300 years. And that's the reason why we are part of the Portuguese-Spanish community, which I'm still till this very day. Which also means that the Dutch are known for free thinking. Many books in Holland were published, which were not to be published anywhere else in the world because they were too much a matter of heresy and too much non-religious or anti-religious. Spinoza is the most famous example of that within the Jewish community. The ban on Spinoza, which I'm sure all our readers and our audience is aware of. And I was raised in a similar kind of tradition, open-minded, But over the years, I realized that the Jewish tradition holds tremendous amount of wisdom. And after I studied philosophy, or was still studying philosophy, I said to myself, I need to know more about the Jewish tradition, Jewish history, and all what goes along with that. And that brought me into the direction of slowly but surely becoming religious. Whether or not I'm religious today, I don't know, because I don't know what that means. But I'm trying to be religious. That's all what I can claim about myself, and do my best. If I ever will make it, I really don't know. And perhaps it is not so, perhaps it is not so important. The road to be traveled is more important than the end destination. But in any way, over the years, I have studied for many years in yeshivot, mainly in Haredi, ultra-Orthodox yeshivot, which gave me a lot of knowledge and was a fantastic time. But once I came to Israel, more than 45 years ago, I realized that I was missing out on a lot of Jewish studies which the yeshiva had not given to me, including people like Rabbi Kook, the famous Rabbi Avram Yitzchak Kook, who was perhaps the greatest religious thinker of this age and even of the last century. And people like Abraham Joshua Heschel, the famous Hasidic professor in America in the Jewish Theological Seminar, Eliezer Berkowitz, and also a very outstanding Talmudist and halachic authority. These people slowly but surely became part of my life. And I became, to a certain extent, their followers, and I learned a lot from them. Also, not one of them I ever met in my life. And that made me to become much more critical, if that's the right word, orati, as we say in Hebrew, about the way in which today the Jewish tradition is practiced and how it is taught and how people live by it. I feel that there is a lot missing there. A lot of wisdom is missing. It is superficial very often. I believe that the halakha, which in generally is being used today by the rabbis, not all of them, but by many rabbis, and especially the official rabbis, is very mainstream, which I believe still belongs to the world of galut, the world of exile, which cannot be applied like that on a modern state, a democratic modern state called Israel. So I basically threw myself into that material to find out what's going on, what are also people saying about that. And that created within me an upheaval, but also at the same time, I started to think about a lot of things differently than perhaps my colleagues did, which sometimes got me into trouble, which I don't mind at all, and is fine. And so I built my own, I don't like the word, but I will use it for a moment, theology and my halachic approach, which is different from the mainstream Orthodox rabbi. I consider myself to be Orthodox. I don't know what that word means, but that is what people say. And I live in a world where many things are combined, from one side free thinkers, which I've studied, to the other side the most right-wing religious denominations within Israel and beyond, reform, conservative, humanitarian, Yahadut, and so on. And that gave me a picture which has been extremely helpful, and also gave me a lot of satisfaction of building my own views, which I have published in several books now. And therefore, I am considered sometimes to be rebellious, which I consider to be a compliment. So that is in short my background.
So the rebellion that has been this tag that's put on you is perhaps unfair, because you have written and you have said repeatedly that Judaism is meant to be dynamic and flexible. And if we go back over the last 3,500 years, and let's loosely call it Judaism, because clearly, especially during the patriarch period, it's monotheism, and much of the First Temple period, a lot of what we do today, they were not doing. It was a Jerusalem temple-based religion for a long time. But let's just, for the sake of easiness, let's just call it Judaism, okay? The path that we have followed, the Torah that was given at Sinai, and the things that we've incorporated into our life. What you've actually said is that what you're doing is trying to bring the real Judaism back, that the fact that things have stagnated to a great degree and that people are doing things by rote, that the idea of the stricter you are, the more religious you are, and not looking for ways to make Judaism, I don't know if you would say user-friendly, but dealing with some of the problems that very often get kicked down the road. I'll give an example, and you yourself, as someone who's very open about the fact that you converted into Judaism, we have in Israel quite a few 100,000 very loyal, devoted citizens, consider themselves Israeli, are in the army, will do anything for the Jewish people, but aren't halachically Jewish because it comes from the matriarchal line and there's a question mark there. And I'm talking about people who mainly came from the former USSR. And something needs to be done here in order to incorporate them into the Jewish state. And things aren't being done. It's just doors are closing. And this is not an issue, I don't want to say it's a problem, it's not an issue that's going to go away. It's going to blow up at some point. And so why do you think that this has happened? Is it out of fear that nobody wants to stand up and say, okay, we've been doing this for the last 100 years, but now things have changed because we have the responsibility of a state, something that we haven't had in a very, very long time. And therefore we have to find ways of integrating people and doing things that perhaps when we were living in our little towns, in our little shtetls, and in our little communities flung around the world, we didn't have to deal with that. So why do you think, is that the answer? Is it fear of going against traditions of the past, really very short span of time in our great history? Is that the main problem?
That is one of the main problems. Fear, no doubt, plays an enormous role within that community, also with the rabbis. But I think there is more to it, and that is that many of the people who have a lot to say about these matters do not realize what has happened in the last 70, 80 years when the State of Israel was established and what radical changes that made on many different levels. And they keep on thinking that you can continue to apply the Jewish tradition and halakha, Jewish law, in the same way as we did in the shtettlers and in all the different little cities around the world. But here we are discussing a completely different way in which Israel now is finding itself, and that is that we have a state with a government, with a army, with a democratic approach. And all these things, I have a feeling, and I have some knowledge about that, are not at all becoming an issue within the mainstream Rabbinate. They or deny it, they ignore it, they are afraid of it. And therefore, it is not just fear, it is also the lack of knowledge which plays an enormous role here. And that is perhaps not completely their fault, because they were never educated to think on their own and think, with new creative ideas, but kept on coming back and turning their head over to what earlier generations have said, who wrote about conditions which are completely different from anything which we encounter now in the State of Israel. So there is a combination of different issues here at work, which is very, very serious and also sad in many ways, because in that way we can't move the Jewish tradition into the State of Israel in the way as it needs to be done, so that it can have a greater influence on Israeli society. And after now nearly more than 70 years, the religious community still hasn't been very successful in showing the general Israeli society the enormous wisdom and the flexibility and the possibilities and the capabilities of the Jewish tradition to deal with a modern state. And therefore, all these people think that the Jewish tradition is outdated, and that has done a lot of harm and even has created hate towards the Jewish tradition, because these people feel that the Jewish tradition stands in their way while they're living in Israel. And that is an enormous tragedy. And that is, I think, one of the main reasons why we have this problem today.
So to play devil's advocate for a minute, so I don't live in the ultra-Orthodox world. I live in what's called the national religious world, the Zionists, in the army, trying to keep halachot and the Jewish traditions while also integrating into Israeli society. But one of the discussions that I have with a friend of mine who does live in the Haredi world, and she's not wrong, and she'll say, look, that's all very well and good, but when it comes to a Torah way of life, the national religious have not succeeded in doing both. The pull of the secular world has been too tantalizing for many in that world, let's say the Zionist religious world. And if you look at the Haredi communities, they're the ones who've really succeeded because maybe of not educating their children or opening them up to the broader world, but they have succeeded in keeping them in a Torah world. And therefore, so if we're talking about, let's say, changing the Rabbinate, which is something that I've spoken openly on this forum and had other guests who were doing that, then I think that in the state of Israel, we need a Rabbinate who themselves, you yourself served in the army. We need religious leaders who understand that they are more than just sitting in a yeshiva, as important as that is, that a huge part of Judaism talks about life as a whole. And not just what we're eating and what we're wearing, but how we're behaving to each other. For goodness sakes, you open up the prophets, that's all they're yelling about. Okay, is being good to each other. How do we create a decent and fair and honest and God-based society? So what do you say to that? And that is, first of all, it's personally a painful subject for me, but it's also, some would say, you're standing on a slippery slope, that if you start opening certain halachot up, then where's the end of it? Before we know it, it's all going to go out the window. And I know you've had these debates.
Yes, I think the reverse is true. And that is that if we continue like we do today, whether it is the Haredi community, but also the Dati Leumi community, which I also have my disagreements, we will not get anywhere. We will get stuck both in our own little worlds. The Dati Leumi community has also many problems, like you just said before, and that is how to deal with the secular world without losing out on your religious commitment. There have been many ways in which their leaders have tried to do that. It hasn't been very successful. I think what needs to happen is that there is a lot to be learned from the Haredi community about commitment, about passion, about really being in fire for the Jewish tradition, while combining that with the awareness that we are living today in a different world, which is not a world of 150 years ago. Now, this takes time, no doubt. I think that the Haredi community, if it wants, could play an important role there, but it also then needs to be open to the challenges which the state of Israel is confronted with, which at the moment it is very little when it comes to that point of view, and come up with a new approach, which is also something acceptable to the, let's say, Zionist Dati Leumi world. This hasn't really happened yet, with one or two exceptions. Also, I see it is growing. I must say, when I look around and what is happening, there's definitely a movement taking place, this very small still, where both communities will come together, learn from each other, and also know how to deal with a secular society, with education. I think the biggest problem is that the yeshivot which we have today, and to a certain extent this is also true about the Dati Leumi yeshivot, is that they do not emphasize enough the spiritual meaning of the Jewish tradition, the transformative side of it, the fact that we have to move. The whole halachic world is in what Eliezer Berkowitz calls a waiting mode. It is waiting to get liberated. And we are not the liberators. And therefore it gets stuck. But we can do that because if you go back to the sources, the Talmudic sources and even earlier sources, we see there many opportunities and many important observations made by the sages, which give us the opportunity to do so. And there were some exceptional people, Rav Kook was one of them, but there were some more, who actually saw that. But they were creative thinkers. And the problem today is people don't think creative. I once said to my students, one of the biggest problems in the yeshiva is that people know so much that they get actually drowned in it. And if you get drowned in something, you can't think out of the box anymore. And that is happening in both these communities. And that is one of the things which I write and speak a lot about. Don't get drowned. Make sure that you have all the information, but use it as a point of departure to start thinking creative and see how solutions could come about. That you're taking a risk by that, and that sometimes it is a slippery slope, true, but that's life. And if you don't go for that, then you get stuck in the past altogether, and tomorrow your children will walk out because they will say, this does no longer speak to me, and then you have lost them. And there is no need for that because there's enough flexibility within the Jewish tradition to be able to do both at the same time. But what we have been doing is anything which does not fit into the box in which we have been educated, we completely ignore, we deny it, we don't want to hear about it. And if you look in the Talmud, you see so many minority opinions which are fantastic when it comes to the 21st century and for Israel, and they are completely ignored. No, we don't paskin like that. That is complete nonsense, because these very minor opinion or minority opinions are specifically mentioned in the Talmud to be used, not to be ignored, but we are ignoring them. And then you have another issue, and that is more the philosophical side of things, and that is that you have to start to think in philosophical terms. What is the ultimate goal of the Jewish tradition? Is it just to live by halakha? No, it isn't. Halakha is a particular way of living, but you are driving on a road. And if you don't know where that road is going, and you don't even speak about the road, then ultimately, so what are you doing? You're just repeating what your grandparents did, and you don't know where we are going, what I call redemptive history. Redemptive history means to say, in German, there's a beautiful expression for this, it's called Heilsgeschichte, which means to say we are ultimately moving through the many centuries from one century into another century, a different kind of tradition, a different kind of tarbut, civilization, and here the prophets come in. They are very important for us in this respect. And that is that they showed us the way, what is the big picture, not only the picture of the Jewish people, but of mankind. Where are we moving to? Halakha cannot teach that because halakha is only busy. We have to do on the road where the train is going, emphatic Judaism, basically asking the question, on which train are we actually at this moment moving forward, and what is it that we ultimately want to achieve? And that question is very little asked today. I get people at my table on Shabbat, and I ask them, how many Masechtot, how many tractates in the Talmud have you learned? And then they tell me that I've learned this and I've learned that, I've learned for many, many years. And then I ask them, so tell me something in a few words. What is this all about? What are you trying to do? What is it to be a religious Jew? If a non-Jew or a non-religious Jew would come to you and they would ask you, why are you religious? What would you answer? And I can tell you one thing, nearly nobody knows to give an answer on that question.
Wow.
And then I go to the Rosh Yeshivot and I say to them, how can it be that after 5 years of learning so many Masechtot, tractates of the Talmud, your students are not able to give an answer to that question? Then the Rosh Yeshivot say, we neither know the answer. We never learned it. We never studied it. And that is a tragedy of the first order.
So, Kvod Harav, what would be your answer to that question?
I would first of all say that one of the things which we need to do is to study, and I'm actually writing at the moment about this, the world of the Agada, that is the non-halachic side of the Jewish tradition, where it speaks about philosophy, where it speaks about spirituality, where it speaks about religiosity, which was always in the yeshivot, also in the yeshivot where I studied, was completely neglected. If we got to a piece in the Talmud which was Agadic instead of halachic, we would basically jump it and we would go to the next piece of halacha because it was not taken serious. But the truth about it is that is perhaps the most serious part of the Talmud, because there it is that you hear the music behind all this. And if you don't hear the music, then you can't play the violin. And that is what is happening.
Something that made a tremendous impression on me, I think the first time I interviewed you in your office in Yerushalayim, is you were listening to classical music, which you do quite often. And you said to me then that music unlocks something in your soul, and that you think that any rabbi, where someone comes with a question asking the rabbi of great importance, that before giving the answer, the rabbi should listen to music, to classical music. I don't remember if you said a specific piece, because that will bring him to a different place. And then he will give an answer that's not just the dry halacha, but something that will answer a need that the petitioner is looking for beyond just the black and white.
Yes, that's I still do that, and I still hold by that opinion.
Incredible. And it made me think also, when we talk about the temple services, and very little that we really know about it, but I come from a family of Levites. That's my father's side. And that's what they used to do. They were the musicians, right, among other things. They were the musicians. That's right. And it's a shame that we don't have their music, that we don't really know what they were singing, because I can only imagine what heights it would have led people to. So to get to the current events, and let's say the Corona current events, and you talk about, you've mentioned about the Haredim not being as integrated into Israeli society. What has happened in the last few months, I don't know if that's been helpful to their community. I'm hearing a lot of anger from people. They don't seem to be taking the vaccine. They didn't seem to be, and again, there were many, many, many exceptions. And obviously what goes on the media has to be taken with quite a few kilos of salt. But I know from also going into towns, there's a town not far from where I live, people not wearing masks, people going to synagogue, people having funerals with 10,000, not just here in Israel, incidentally, 10,000 people attending a funeral, nobody complying with social distancing, and of course, a commensurate, very high illness in their community that has made people in Israel, but I'm sure in other communities as well, and in the non-Jewish communities, it even frightens me because it could even lead to anti-Jewish sentiment because they're identifiably Jewish. What's going on here? We have a world pandemic. How can you feel that you're not a part of what the medical community or the government or is asking us to do? What's your feeling about the last few months in this particular situation?
Well, it is extremely disturbing. I consider it to be a Chilul Hashem, really the very
a desecration of God's name.
Of God's name. And it is very anti-halachic, because the halacha clearly states that you have to look after your health. You shall look after your souls, which means after your health. And the reason why they don't seem to be very particular about that has a sociological background. And one has to understand that. What is happening, I've been speaking with people in that world, is that they are afraid that if they will go along with all the requirements and the demands of the government, and not socializing, not coming together, not having big chatunot and things like that, they will lose these people and they will walk out on the Jewish tradition, because what they use is basically social pressure. There's a lot of social pressure in that world. You need to belong to the club, and the club requires from you this and this and this and this. As long as you do that, you're part of us. The moment that you are no longer being prepared to go along with that, then you have a problem. and you may lose your stand within our community. So what is happening is basically that they are saying, we are prepared to take the risk of some people getting ill and even die, but as long as we keep the community together, we can be sure that therefore they continue to follow this or that rabbi or rebbe, a Hasidic rebbe or whatever it is. And that is more important to us, that we keep this core of people going from a Jewish Orthodox perspective, then the question concerning yes or no, some people getting ill and perhaps, God forbid, to die. Nobody wants that to happen, but the fact is that it happens. And the reason why it happens is because they are so afraid to close their yeshivot at this moment or for the last year already, because what is going to be with all these young people who are now sitting at home and don't know how to spend their time? And my answer to that is, and I've written about it, is how can it be that you gave a Jewish education to these people that in case they find themselves in a situation as they are now, that they are walking out on the Jewish tradition? It means to say that you gave them a very poor Jewish education, because if they really know what Yahadut is all about, it would never happen. So it means to say there's something basically wrong with your education. And this is hard for them because they don't want to hear about philosophy, and they don't want to hear about theological issues and about the grand view, let's say, of the Jewish tradition. It's all halakha and again halakha and nothing else but halakha. And therefore they're losing their people. But that is because the kind of Jewish education you gave them was the wrong one. And you better wake up, because otherwise tomorrow you will indeed lose people. But the answer is not by not telling people to listen to the government. It is by teaching them that even when they're at home, they are proud Jews who want to stay religious, because there's so many other ways in doing that. You don't need a yeshiva for that. The yeshiva creates a ruach, a spirit, obviously, of holding together, making sure that we do what the community requires from us. I can't stand on my own feet. I'm depending on that community. And if you cannot stand on your own feet, so what kind of religiosity is this? And this is a big question, which I have asked many times, and I never get an answer to that, because they agree and they admit that this is their greatest concern, even more than the coronavirus itself.
Wow. It must be so incredibly stressful, and it must be, I'm looking at now really with empathy, it must be incredibly stressful on many people in their community who you can't keep away now from the internet, you can't keep away from the outside world, who maybe would like to make a different kind of change, but can't go up against what you just mentioned, which is really the incredible support that the community gives. And it's an amazing thing. It really is an amazing thing. You're never without, you're never lonely, for good or for bad. In a world where many people are suffering from those two things, from tremendous loneliness and not having anyone around, they have a huge support system. But to make a change within that as an individual must be just incredibly stressful. And I can imagine what's happening now inside their communities that we don't even know about, because it's an internal kind of dialogue that's happening or not happening, as it were.
Yeah, the problem is that it is most of the time not happening. It is kept quiet. There's a lot of silence there. And what they don't realize is that people are not crazy. And one day they will wake up, especially the younger people, and say, what kind of community am I living in? And then they will walk out altogether. They go, as we say in English, off the derech. And then you have lost them. And why did you lose them? Because you never gave them the material and the chomer, as we say in Hebrew, of being able to stand on their own feet in case of need. Like, for example, now is the coronavirus. So they are losing people now, and they're going to lose many more people because of the coronavirus, because of this policy, because ultimately it won't work. So, is it risky? Yes, it is risky.
So when we talk about policy, we talk about, let's say, the government policy. So Israel has stood out really in making an effort to take care of the weak. Okay, there have been other countries, and this has been written about and spoken about in the last year, countries, let's say, like Sweden or Britain, where it seemed to some degree that they were going to let their old people go, right? So let's, if people were getting sick and that was a susceptible community, okay, And Israel refused to do that. But on the other hand, and this has been, and we are in the middle now of a third lockdown, and it's probably, which has kind of been a joke for the last few days, but I would imagine now is going to be taken seriously because we have a very high illness rate and the hospitals are at capacity. And even though the vaccine is here, it's a race. But then we have economic difficulties. We have, especially forget tour guides, especially store owners and restaurant owners who have suffered terribly. And that's also led to a certain loss of life, definitely loss of dignity, more violence in the house. Anybody who doesn't do well with anxiety, we have more wife beatings and anything you can imagine happening within the home. So what do you think that Israel has been correct on this? Where is the balance here between saving lives by making sure people are sequestered as much as possible and not getting sick, yet closing down an economy which has the ramifications, as I just mentioned, and many of which I think we're going to be dealing with for quite a few years. Even when the ill of the virus is gone, the social ills that were born in the last year, the kids not in school, and all of that that's happened, the fallout from that is going to be with us for quite a long time. And certain people, it's going to affect their lives. How would you see it if they came to you as for advice from the Israeli government? Do you think they made mistakes? Where do you find the balance here in what's happened?
I do feel that they made mistakes, but if you ask me what exactly the balance should be, I think there should be balance. How to build that, I'm not sure about because I don't have all the information. I'm an outsider in that respect, but to only emphasize the physical situation of our society by keeping them alive and not thinking about the enormous psychological damage which is done at the same time should have been dealt with in a different way. And the government gave very little attention to that. And now we pay the price for it. Yes. So I do not have an easy answer to that,
right.
But I would definitely say that one of the answers could have been found within a different kind of Jewish education for religious and non-religious people, where they could have found some kind of balance which would have worked better. It has a lot to do with one other issue, and that is the question about the meaning of life. Why are we living? Most people are not asking that question. Now, with the coronavirus, suddenly they are confronted with death, even when they're young people. And that has created, on the one side, lots of depression. On the other side, it has also created people to say, wait a moment, why do I want to live? What is so important about this? Why do I want to be part of a particular Jewish people or a particular Jewish society? And here comes up an extremely difficult issue which has not been dealt with in the religious community, and it has also not been dealt with in the secular community. And that is that human beings are meaning seeking beings. We are always looking for meaning. And if we are not discussing that in the classroom, and we are not discussing that in the yeshivot, which we don't most of the time, then we are not giving these people the possibility of thinking, what is life all about? What should it be all about? And I remember a very famous statement made by a non-Jewish thinker by the name of, wait a moment, I'm just looking for his name, Albert Camus, who was a very great French writer, who was completely secular, who once said the following words: there is only one serious philosophical problem, and that is suicide. And that is a very deep statement. What he meant to say is, we have to ask ourselves the question, why don't we want to commit suicide? Because if we commit suicide, we have solved all the problems. I don't have pain anymore. I don't have any problems anymore. I have committed suicide. And Abraham Joshua Heschel responded to that and he said, no, the biggest problem in life is there something in life to be prepared to die for? And that's exactly the other side of the coin. It is saying, there must be values in life which are so great that in case you have to give them up, you would perhaps indeed give up your life for that. But that's positive, not like Camus said, it is negative in the sense of thinking about committing suicide.
Mm-hmm.
And I think these two people have expressed in two lines basically what this whole issue is all about. People are more today, I also hear this from young people, asking the question, why am I to be Jewish? What is the meaning of human existence? What is the meaning of the world of the Gentiles? What kind of role as Jews do we play in there? How can we help them? How can we help ourselves? What is our mission in life? And exactly that issue is not discussed within the religious world most of the time, and definitely also not in the secular world. So therefore you get a lot of depression, not because of the coronavirus, but because people don't know anymore. Now that they have the time to think about it, they can't go to school, they can't go to work. You have to give them now something instead, and we are not doing that. And because of that, you get a lot of problems for which they should not have any reason if we would have given much more time to these meaning-seeking, let's say, needs of the human being. And I think we have to go back there. And I think that probably will happen within the next few years, because otherwise people will drop more and more into a crisis. Even when the corona is behind us, they won't get out of the crisis which the corona has created. What I personally believe is that we are slowly but surely entering into a new world order. We are going through the stages now where we, because of corona, but not corona as the ultimate cause of it, but as basically a symptom of it, of asking ourselves, what is this all about? The mystery of life, whatever name you want to give it, the fact that we are alive, what is the purpose behind all that? That is, or has to become a much more focused issue within the school system, in the university and in the yeshiva world. And at the moment, very little is done in that field. I remember when I was in university, you could study anything except one question. Why do you live? What is the meaning behind it? Which is the most ultimate question that human beings need to ask. But probably because we are afraid of what the answer is going to be, we walked out and turned our back on it. And that won't be possible anymore because we will create more and more problems for people. People need meaning. If you don't have meaning, you get yourself into lots of trouble. And that is what the government here in Israel has completely overlooked, mainly because they are not educators and because they're thinking in purely political terms and they don't think in moral, or for that reason, better in meaningful terms, whether it is religious or non-religious, but this is a huge, huge problem. And I think we have to open that door within our educational system and in our educational world to allow that question and the answers to that question to come in again. It's not an easy undertaking because it means a whole shift in a different direction within our educational system, which for years we have basically ignored and didn't want to hear about because it was too dangerous to deal with that problem. Because the moment you're going to ask questions about meaning, you're asking questions related to religion, to philosophy. And these are difficult issues. I don't want to hear what I don't like, but sometimes you have to hear what you don't like because that's the only way how you can live a proper life.
You know, it occurs to me that just that, like the politicians are politicians and they're not educators and nobody expects them to be, but just like the prime minister has, whatever we call it here, a national security council, right? So he knows that he doesn't know everything that's happening in our lovely little neighborhood. And if he's going to take a step, whether it's open relations with the country or perhaps go against the country because some of their plans are nefarious to our existence, he's going to sit and he's going to speak to people who are experts in the field, intelligence experts, whatever it is. Perhaps it's time that we had a similar body of educators, philosophers, rabbis, imams, a good part of our population here, and we are in Israel, are not Jewish, are Druze, are Muslim, are Christian. And all these people sit and give advice to the politicians, who are just politicians, on the things that you just mentioned. It's such a, I don't know if something like that exists. If it exists, we're certainly not feeling it. But perhaps it's time. I'm not saying a Sanhedrin, which was the body of rabbis who really dealt with a long time ago. I'm not saying that. I'm saying something that also fits into the modern world and educational things, and computers, which are part of our lives, can be used for the good, can be used for the bad. I don't know, maybe we should approach one of the political parties, because once again, we have elections coming up, so we could, and maybe that's even something that one of these political parties should even put into their platform or speak about openly. I think that a lot of people would say, wow, you know, this is true. The corona has caused a crisis, but it's also created opportunities for veering in a different direction. And perhaps this is an idea whose time has come. May I nominate you for the head of the committee?
Thank you very much. Thank you very much. I fully agree with that. I think there indeed is a very crucial role to be played by some of the parties when we are going again to the Bechirot, and that has to be emphasized. But I haven't heard yet any one of these parties to speak about it.
I haven't either. So, all right, maybe I'll drop an email to some people tomorrow. I'm just joking. I don't have that kind of.
I will definitely do that as well. But this is very, very necessary. Very necessary.
And really, maybe the time has come. You know, many of my listeners are Christian, and I know that even though we talk about Judaism, a lot of this hits home for them. The search for meaning, also for teaching their children to have a relationship with God. It's not about the rituals within their religion. Do you have the late Rabbi Lord Jonathan Sachs used to do interfaith meetings? He was also a tremendous philosopher, in addition to being just a very interesting thinker out of the box as you are. Is that something that you do, or you're really concentrating on within the Jewish world and making an impact on?
No, I do this also with the Christian world and with the secular world as well. Sometimes more, sometimes little, depending on the conditions and the situation. But I think that this is a very big part of the mission of the Jewish people and of the Jewish tradition, and we should give this much, much more attention. What I find also is something very interesting, and that is that a lot of young, also religious, but also irreligious young people are asking, why is it that we only focus on ourselves? Why is it that we always speak about the Jewish people? Don't we have something to say to the rest of the world? And the answer is yes, we have a lot to say to them, which they are probably very pleased with if we would say it. And we haven't done that. Jonathan Sachs, who was a very close friend of mine, has done that. And has done that marvelously. And his teachings really should now even more being emphasized and made public, also in the non-Jewish world, because he got the actual issues and he was able to verbalize them in a most beautiful way, and therefore he was so incredibly influential. But I tell you something, this may sound a little critical. I'm afraid that now that he's badly enough no longer with us, it will slowly die again. And instead that it starts to flourish. Why? Because if you don't have a mover behind that, and it does not become a movement, then it will die. And I'm afraid that since he was a lonely man, yes, many of us are lonely people, and we don't have a movement behind us. And once the leader, like Jonathan Sachs, is no longer there, it slowly falls back into the old system. And that is the greatest tragedy which would happen. But the possibility that it happens is great, because you need to pick up, or you must have people, a whole movement. I'm not even speaking about a party, but about a movement which says, okay, Rabbi Jonathan Saks's ideas are what we are now going to develop far beyond where he went. He gave us the foundation on which this all needs to stand. Let's move forward. Whether or not that will happen, I don't know, and I have my doubts. And that worries me tremendously.
Do you have students? You have people
Sure.
that you're educating over the last few decades in the way that you think and the way that you teach?
Sure, I have this academy of mine where we have the people there. That's not very big, mainly because what really needs to happen is we need to create a kind of new yeshiva built on totally different foundations than the yeshivot which we have up till now, where these teachings become vital and instrumental in how to educate these young students. But we are not building these yeshivot. There are one or two perhaps who have a little bit, who are doing a little bit. They don't have the money to do it. This is one of the biggest problems, because often the finances go to the wrong places, let's be quite honest. Right. And therefore they don't really have the power to do this. And that needs to be changed. And how to get this changed is by constantly speaking about it till somebody at a certain moment says, okay, we really have to start doing this properly, but we're speaking about millions and millions of dollars, if not more than that. But there's enough money to do it. But somebody has to get up and to say, okay, we must provide these people with the opportunity that they can build that kind of yeshiva program, whatever name you want to give it. But there's very little done in this field. People always go back to the old, to because that's not threatening. Anything what is new is threatening by definition. And people, especially in the Orthodox world, is something which people want to stay away of.
And also what happens, at least here in Israel, is very many of these budgets do come from the government. And so the ones in politics and the ones who gets elected, they're the ones who get the money for whatever institution it is that's important to them. And very often those without political power are also left without the means to promote their ideas.
Yeah, that is a very big problem. And I would say, perhaps a little different from what you just said, the prime minister needs to be an educator. He can't be only a politician, definitely not in Israel. He must have a background. I mean, people like Ben Gurion, however much he was a completely secular Jew, was an educator. And he understood what was going on. But that is not the case anymore in our today's government. Yeah. And therefore, these people don't even know what it means when you speak about education. I've spoken with some of them. It's very clear this is totally outside their world, outside their box. They're so busy with politics that they don't realize that education should be on the top of their list, because that is what makes the future.
Right. And always, I mean, as the people of the book, I mean, from the very beginning, teach your children, teach your children Torah, teach your children how to behave, has been a major mandate for any parent. And the family structure has been the major cell, if you will, of how Judaism is built. Yep. And within that comes the need to raise children who will have the values and be the good people that we want them to be. Rav Cardoza, are you hopeful?
Yes, I'm always hopeful. I believe it will ultimately happen. What worries me, how long it will take. It's not that it won't happen. It will happen because at a certain moment we will be pushed in a corner and we won't have another opportunity but to let it happen. But the question is, in the meantime, how much damage has been done or will be done? And that is where we need to work as much as we can to see that the damage is limited. And how earlier we get into that new stage, what I call the new world order, the better it is. But we have, after all, a population which likes to go back to its old ways. You know, once the coronavirus is over, we all know quite well that most people will go back to the way how they have lived before. But they should have learned from the coronavirus. Speaking about economy, speaking about the fact that we have learned in the corona times that we can do with much less comfort, with much less money. We don't have to do all these expensive things, going on vacation, travel, and things like that. there are many also ways how we can make our lives meaningful. And very often what happens, what has happened in the past is that people do not know how to deal with themselves. Why are all these shoppers out there in all the different kind of big marketplaces and shops? The reason is not because they want to buy something, but because they don't know what to do with themselves when they're sitting at home. And therefore they look for entertainment. And we have to learn them that the real entertainment is what you do with yourself and how you grow, how you become a greater being. But that is left out of our educational system. And very few people know about that. It's a big problem.
So one of the, and we're going to wrap up just in a couple of minutes, but one of the fascinating things that you've discussed in your books is the difference between, it's usually called Sephardi, but more correctly Mizrahi, the different rabbis and the different thinkers from this part of the world, the Near East, if you will, as opposed, and let's even call it the more Muslim part of the world, at least it has been for the last over 1,000 years, as opposed to where you come from, the cold and climates of Ashkenaz, of Europe. And I think that it's taken Israelis a while to realize that we are actually in the Middle East, that a lot of maybe the thinking and definitely some of the halachot are transplanted here from Europe, where they don't really fit. And many of the sources that you have quoted as saying, you know, we're not going against halakha, this was an opinion that we can lean on, actually come from some of the great rabbis who lived in Babylon, who lived in Syria, in this part of the world for hundreds of years. So I just wanted to throw that out to my listeners because I think it's a fascinating insight into still how geography makes a difference. And one of the points that you've made in the past is that you think even the weather makes a difference. That when you live in a warm climate, you're more open to things, or you're maybe even a little nicer than when you're all bundled up and freezing half of the time. It affects your personality.
You know, it is interesting that you make that point. You know, as I said, I come from a Sephardi background. The Portuguese, Spanish are Sephardi, right? In Amsterdam, they were the people who did not walk around in black clothes, but in colorful clothes. And they had a lot of fun in their lives and so on, which is perfect. And they did that in according to the halakha. But they had a very different approach to halakha, which is very fascinating, which we need to bring back. The reason why the Ashkenazi community didn't live like that is because A, they had pogroms and they had lots of problems which the Sephardim didn't have all the time. It was a good time in Spain for a long time. Things went well over there and they were part of the culture, while obviously in the cold, in the very, very difficult dark ages, especially in the Middle Ages in Europe, the colorfulness of life was taken away from them. And what is happening now here in Israel is that they have taken this colorless life into Israel. And that is very, very artificial by now. And we have to get rid of that. But now it became suddenly, you know, the right thing to do. If you are a Haredi, you must walk in black. Sephardi never had anything like that. But now the Sephardim have taken it over from the Ashkenazi, which is a terrible tragedy. Should have been the other way around.
Well, so maybe one of the side benefits of if Israel's normalizing ties now with Morocco, and we have many Jews living here, including my daughter's mother, she married into a family that originally came from Morocco, my daughter, and now people will feel free to travel there more, to learn about some of the history there, and who knows, maybe come back with that more, the colorful clothes, the colorful attitudes, more really of what we have here in the Middle East, which is
also important to, absolutely right. Also to mention here is that the halachic approach of the Sephardi great poskim, halachic authorities, was much broader, much more optimistic, was much more inviting than what happened in the Ashkenazi world. And the truth about it is that most of our halachic authorities today come from a Ashkenazi background or have adopted that particular point of view, while they should really look into the halachic decision-making programs of the Sephardi world, where they will see many opportunities they have never heard about. And I'm indeed one of the people who constantly makes that point. Let's look into the great halachic authorities and observations which were made by the Sephardim, because they had a better way of dealing with life. And it was a more optimistic way. It was much more musical. And that is missing within that Ashkenazi world. And I say this with the greatest amount of respect, because I've been trained within that Ashkenazi world, but now I realize that there was a whole piece missing there.
So maybe that's the next step of the kibbutz galuyot, of the ingathering of the exiles back in our ancient homelands, is to realize where we are on the map, but really where we are on the map, and that there's a lot of the culture and a lot of that thinking that's here in this part of the world and was in this part of the world by our sages for so long, that's been ignored or made kind of like second tier. And it's time to integrate that back into Judaism and really reinvigorate this program, if you will, that both of us and so many of my listeners love so much and want to bring to its potential. A sentence that my children hated when I would say to them, right? But I want you to reach your potential. So I stopped saying it years ago, but that's exactly what it is.
You're right, you're absolutely right.
That's what it is. There's so much more to this than meets the eye. And I want to thank you really for the Rav Natan Lopes-Cardoza, for the tremendous impact you've had on my way of thinking, on just even, I realize I don't have to have the answers, but I need to ask the questions. And that's what you are doing. That's possibly the most important thing, is you're asking the questions, and people are squirming because they don't want to hear the questions. But they have to be raised and when they're raised by someone like you, who is so educated, so devoted to Judaism, you're not coming as an outlier. You're not coming as someone who wants to take it apart, coming as someone who wants it to reach its potential. It's very hard to ignore you. And I hope that people don't. And so where can my listeners, if they're not familiar with your writings, where can they get a hold, or where can you send out weekly newsletter as well? How can they subscribe? And
the best way is to go to my website, www.cardozoacademy.org. And there you will find all the information. There you can become part of my weekly essays and so on. Doesn't cost a penny. It's just a matter that I need your email and that I need your name, and we put you on the list. We have tens of thousands of readers, and we are increasing this, and we are going to do more podcasts. So once the corona is over, and we have also things which we have in mind, and Jew and also non-Jew are able to make use of that, because there's a lot what we can say, which is also very important to the non-Jewish world, even to the Christian world. And I'm only proud to be able to be part of that. So that is the place where to go, because there you will find all the information.
Okay, amazing. And it's in English, the newsletter, right?
This is all in English.
Okay.
Everything is in English, because most of our people are from outside Israel.
Okay, so no excuses, everybody. But I can't read the Hebrew. I don't.
No, they can't use that argument.
You have to think of something else. And if you want to really broaden your mind and go out of your comfort zone, I think it's time. And all of you know that that's a big thing that I'm constantly saying, right? We need to leave our comfort zones, and then we expand our comfort zones and become really the great people that I deeply believe Hashem wants all of us to be. Each one of us. He's our biggest battle.
I just want to add, just for the people who are watching us, there are two books which I've written, and I'm not saying this for any economic reason. I say this purely for spiritual reasons, and that is one book which you know, Jewish Law as Rebellion, which is a big book about all these topics, which also non-Jews should read. And I just brought out the second volume on Chumash. I'm writing, or have already written, a commentary on all 5 of the books of Moses, of the Pentateuch, of the Torah, and just my book on Shemot came out last week. And there you find a lot of the stuff which you just discussed. Exodus.
Fantastic.
Genesis is already out for some time. Exodus, I'm now working on Leviticus.
Fabulous. And especially in these days when there's so many people trying to shunt the Bible aside and criticize the Bible and say it never happened and it was just some scribes writing down some stories that they heard once upon a time, then really understanding it is all that
There's
much more
much more to
important.
it. Yes.
Okay. All right, Rav Natan Lopes-Cardozo, thank you once again. And Bezrat Hashem, this is not our last conversation. And
Okay.
and we're keeping an eye on you. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
And
I'm
be
honored.
well. Be
You
well.
also keep well, keep healthy, and we'll meet again.
To all of our listeners, okay? Onto the brave new world, to paraphrase.
That's right.
Okay.
Best regards to all the listeners. Be well.
Thank you so much, everyone. Eve Harow, with thanks to Ben and to Tabitha and those at the Land of Israel Network. You can always write to me, eve@thelandofisrael.com. Love to hear your feedback. And just stay well, everyone. And hopefully we're past the really dark days and things are only going to get better from here. So take care, everyone, and goodbye for now.